Again, I have to remind myself we're in the composition class. We're not in the grammar. I'm not diagramming tonight. I'm talking to you about writing. And you have your first paper that will be submitted tonight, which I look forward to reading in the next few weeks. So tonight I'm going to continue where I left off about writing and what makes for good writing, and the approach that I use in teaching students how to write well. It's been an approach that has worked for me and worked for my many students throughout the years, so I'll continue to share that with you this evening. First of all, I want to go back, though, and revisit some of the concepts that I mentioned 2 weeks ago. And that had to do with the 4 basics. And my question was to you, how can I write well right now, where I'm at? And I gave you 4 helpful hints. See if you can recall them. I mentioned the most important one, as I see it, is exposure. And I think exposure all by itself will teach you most of what you need to write, because we make language the way we see it. So exposure to models that are written the way you want to write is key for you. So right now, you should be reading a host of personal narrative testimonies. I have given you some examples that are assigned, but I want you to go out and read others as well and study it for the craft. It's called reading for the craft. And you will not merely experience the effect of the writing, but you'll see how the effect is wrought. And the more you expose yourself to the writing, you're looking at it from the lens of a writer. So you look at it differently than somebody who is just reading it for the mere pleasure of reading it. You're certainly doing that. But you're also looking at how did they effectively bring me in, and what techniques did they use? And you kind of pull it apart. You take it apart and look at it and view it in that way. That's a great help for you as writers. You might find some writers that you particularly care for, more so than others. And so you learn to study, why do you like that type of writer and what techniques do they use? You think, well, will I be sounding like that writer and modeling that writer? In some ways you are. But soon you will shed the skin, so to speak, of that writer, and you will develop your own voice. So this is the best tip that I can give you, is to go out and read the type of writing that you're involved in presently. The second technique of how to write well right now is having the purpose or the motivation to write well. You can't write well if you don't want to. But as Gibbs students, you have that motivation, I would hope. You have that purpose of writing, and it was, of course, ultimately to glorify Jesus Christ and the privilege you have of writing that story. So say something you are passionately about to an audience of real people and get as a reward their thoughtful responses to what you wrote. So exposure and purpose will almost teach you to write well by themselves, interestingly enough. The third suggestion I have is to have to write well, you have to write. And the more you write, the better. So every week when I come in, as a result, you'll have a writing assignment. But also on your own, I would like you to start doing writing for your own pleasure and leisure. But it's important that we keep the writing momentum going so that each week you'll have something that you'll be working on. And lastly, what has helped writers is the feedback side of it. You need readers to tell you, were they convinced by what you wrote? Was the explanation clear? Did the opening paragraph capture their attention? Did they like your voice as a writer? So cultivate people who will read your work and react to it in a way they'd react to it if you were having a lively conversation with them. So in this course, you're very fortunate because you get feedback. You get feedback from me, and I will be very careful about this. And the feedback is offered as suggestions. I, as your writing coach, I'm not dictating what changes you need to make, but I'm giving them as suggestions. But also, as I mentioned, it's important you have feedback from other people outside of the instructor. And that would be people that you trust. But remember my suggested process on this as well. When you are giving a writing project, whether it is something that you're going to have an audience just read or something that you're working on as far as a speaking situation, you write with that door closed at the beginning. And you know the Lord is there with you, but that door is closed because you don't need outside voices right now affecting your writing. So you write and you go through several drafts, iterations with that door closed. And then when you're ready, you think, okay, I need a few audience members to come in and take a look or give me their suggestions. You open that door slightly and you let in those selected few. And as I mentioned last week, or last session, my husband is one of those who come through the door and I ask for his feedback. Then the door is closed again and I make decisions. Am I going to use some of those suggestions? And he is an audience, so I need to take those seriously. And what changes am I going to make in light of the feedback? And then the door is opened again, and there comes a point where finally you as the writer have to step out of that door, and then you submit your work. You submit the work in class, or you submit the work to whatever published entity you are working for. And it's hard as writers to let go. It is very difficult for me to, after I'm done and gone through all my iterations, to hand over my work and say, okay, because I always think as a writer, there's probably more that I could work on and improve. And that's how good writers think. And even when it's published and I'll look at some work, I'll think, oh, I could have done this or that. But there's a time where you need to let it go and you need to trust the feedback that you've received. So those are my 4 suggestions for you. I also had a few others. And I said, if you want to be a writer, you must also read a lot and write a lot. So I hope right now you're in the phase of reading. And there are many articles in the Grace Family Journal that you can go in there and you can read and get a sense of good writing. Also, cultivate Christian writers that you appreciate and read their work. But you're reading it differently now, recall. You're reading it through the lens of a writer because you are a writer. And that's how you need to look at it. So we read for several reasons: to experience sometimes the mediocre, and also we read for pleasure, but we also read to evaluate our writing against what we read and how it can affect our writing experience as well. So there are my 4 suggestions of how you can write well right now. It's interesting because writing has 4 legs to it. Each leg is like the single leg of a sturdy chair that holds up the writing. And the first one I put down is style. And style has to do with how one writes. And you think about style in relationship to clothing or also writing. And as individuals, we make decisions regarding our clothing style, but we also make decisions in our writing regarding our writing style, because language is the raiment with which we clothe our thoughts. And if you don't have style in your writing, it will become boring, it can become mundane, and it does not affect an audience. So we as writers work at our style, and you'll see this tonight in some of my suggestions. We add concretions to our writing. We add illustrations. We're always looking to vitalize or make our writing come alive, and that, again, will be suggestions I will give you this evening and throughout the semester. We also, as writers, know that we have to have some structure, but it's interesting with the first essay that you'll be writing for this class will be the personal narrative essay, your testimony. And that has the loosest, if you will, of all organizational styles that you'll be working on and writing. So you know that with the personal narrative, it will have a beginning and an end and have a middle and things in between. But it is not as strict and formalized as some others. So with each genre that we're going to work on in this class, I will give you suggestions about the structure of that particular essay. Certainly, another leg of this chair has to be readability. Now, not everyone in an audience is going to like what you wrote, but you want to have that as your objective. You want to make sure you have your work readable. and it affects an audience. And tonight, again, I'm going to give you suggestions on how you can do just that. And then, lastly, when we're looking at an audience, we must also consider the grammar, expressing language in acceptable form. But that's the last leg that I brought up. Because, remember my quote, writing is first creative, then corrective. Right now, with the personal narrative testimony, you're on that creative side, and you will be there for a while. So you've had a couple weeks to think about it, to mull it over, maybe jot down some thoughts. The next few weeks, you'll be taking those thoughts and those ideas, and you're putting it down on paper and still doing the creative side of it. Then you'll be submitting it to me. I'll give you the date of that at the end of this session. And you'll say, this is the best it can be at this point in my writing process. When we finally make the decision, this is going to be the portfolio piece, my printable version, then we're having all these pieces together. And that's when we work on the grammar and the mechanics. But first, you have to think in terms of creative and also affecting an audience. So what makes writing readable? This is perhaps the goal of writing. When you set out to write, you're asking, what am I trying to accomplish? And you can't write well until you know the answer, and I'm boiling it down to a simple expression. What makes writing readable, or what makes writing good? Here it is, writers. Good writing is aware of its audience. That will drive your writing. That will motivate you in your writing as well. With good writers, they feel the presence of an audience just like a stage actor does. Except for the writer, the audience is imagined. So when you're in your office or your study and you're writing whatever it is you're working on, whether it's a piece for this course or it's something you're working on for a Sunday school class, a Bible school class, a retreat, a camp, you're in that office and you're thinking of your audience. And you're thinking, to whom am I really addressing this? And you're keeping them in mind, and as a result, it motivates you to want to write well. Because you're writing to people for an intended effect, and you're thinking about that. What is the effect of this piece that I'm working on? And also, you need that imaginary reader in your head, because let's play this out. You have all been in composition classes for many years. You've taken them throughout your educational lifetime. And who was the audience that was in your head in those classes for the most part? Tell me, please. The teacher. And so because it was the teacher, right away, your tendency is, I have to write this paper for him or her and try to please him or her. And so that made you stiff in some ways, formal. You didn't sound like yourself, and quite often you submitted work that you didn't really like because you were thinking of the audience of one, and in many cases, it was the audience of a disapproving instructor. And that's why many students come out of the courses saying, I don't like to write. Because then the feedback they would get would be a grade on top of the paper, and that was it. Put the paper back in your bag and off you go. And that was the experience. So I'm changing this up here for you now. And I'm saying you're not writing to an audience of one. I am one member in your audience, and I'm here as your writing coach and guide. But you have to think broader than just Mrs. Helen, who's my one audience member. It's interesting as we think about an audience. Quite often when students were writing papers in their composition classes, they were not only writing to an audience of one, but they changed up my quote. And they thought that writing is ultimately and only corrective. And they didn't see the creative side. Nobody has said this about Tom Steagle's essays or his articles. Oh my, did you read Tom Stiegel's article? My, what comma placement he had. Did you notice his use of semicolons in that article? People don't talk like that. What they talk about is the effect that it wrought them as a reader in the audience. Now, times past, an English instructor might have said, you've got to get that semicolon in the right place, make sure you have the comma, and that is all true. But if we start there, we're starting stiff, and we're starting informal, and we're not probably going to write well. So, again, this is the key. What makes writing readable, what makes writing good is aware of your audience, which is broader than the instructor. So I'm going to emphasize this throughout the semester. The presence of the audience motivates your writing. And writer's audience must be imagined. But even when we're writing, we're thinking of how we want to either emphasize a certain word in the reader's head. So if we want something emphasized, we might put it in italics. We might put it in bold if we want a bolder statement. We might put semicolons. All of these decisions that we're making is driven by our concern for the reader and the readability of the text. So even sometimes the font style affects that as well. So always think reader, because that separates good writing from bad, the sense of the audience. And write to people in order to do something to them. And once you get the secret of good writing firmly in your mind, you think in a different way about writers' decisions. So don't be writing and ask, what should I say next? You're writing and you're thinking, what does the reader expect to hear next? And that's driving your decisions as a writer. So you get outside of yourself, because good writing gives readers everything they need to read you well. And psychologically, readers are doing a lot of different jobs as they're reading. And it's your job as the writer to assist them in that process. Another suggestion that I have for you is good writing reads out loud well. So you will hear me in this course read out loud portions of essays. Sometimes it might be larger chunks of it. It might be yours, though I won't give the name of the writer. It might be former students that I've had. But I want you to get the sound of good writing in your head, and a lot of times it's by hearing it read to you. And this starts early on in our lives. Little children love to be read to. And so as parents, or as friends, or as nieces, or as nephews, or whatever, we read to them because they love that. They love the sound of good writing in their heads as youngsters. And somewhere along the line, we lose that. So you're going to be read to in this class, and I'm going to read you some pieces that are written well, so you get the sound of that in your head. And you might do that as well. When you're studying for the craft as a writer, you think, oh, I really like that opening. So you take that and you read it out loud, and you hear it. You hear that sound in your head, you hear the cadence, you hear the rhythm, you hear the vitalizing techniques, and that actually does become a part of your thinking and your writing. So, again, good writing is aware of its audience. Now, here are some key questions that we ask as writers about the audience and purpose at earlier stages of our writing. And I want to use The Unknown Riches by Jim Miller as an example as we answer these questions. So here's the first question. When I'm writing something, or whatever occasion it might be, who are my readers? In your personal narrative testimony, thinking even of Jim Miller's, who are the readers? Now, I have to say this. When he was writing the essay in the class, little did he think the essay would end up in the Grace Family Journal. But initially, thinking of your essay as well, who are the readers? Who's going to read the personal narrative testimony as you see it, outside of Mrs. Hellenden? I'm just one member in your audience, remember. Who do you think? Friends? Yes. Family? Acquaintances? Sometimes even, I wrote a story about it. Would you want to read it? And it's interesting how these personal narrative testimonies have gone out and affected an audience. The second question you ask is, what do they need to know? Thinking about Jim Miller's Unknown Riches, what did they need to know about the testimony he wrote? So when he's writing it, what did he think that they needed to know? His background, and also he felt they needed to know other things. What was that? Remember where I was coming from? He was saved at a very young age. Pardon me? His environment. And also, I think he felt they needed to know, I was saved at a young age, took for granted what I'd been taught, what I'd been learned. But I did learn along the way that His grace is sufficient, and I had unknown riches that I wasn't even aware of. But he had to learn some things along the way until he got there. Another question you ask, what do I want them to believe? When all is said and done, and I've submitted my personal testimony and it goes out there to the audience, what do I want them to believe? Thoughts on that? That would be fine. Yes, thank you, Gus. Is there a microphone?
In his particular case, probably he wanted other believers who had been saved at a young age to learn from what he had experienced,
Yeah.
possibly to be able to associate with what he had gone through,
Mm-hmm.
possibly for younger believers in the church, that they could catch on sooner to some of these things that had been hidden to him.
Yeah.
And for unbelievers reading it, I'm sure some component of it was focused on a clear testimony of salvation by faith alone.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And you probably recall my story where he came to me and he said, I don't know, this is going to be short paper because I got saved when I was 7 years old and that was it. And I said, think broader than that. What is your testimony after you were saved and beyond? And he went and he thought, I know who my audience is. It's those people who've been saved at a young age and grew up in a Christian home and their journey. So that was his audience. And why should they care about what I have to say? You have to make them want to care. That's what causes them to want to read on. Because if they can find themselves in the piece, they will care. And they will want to take away what you have to share with them. So thinking about audience and purpose can be helpful at earlier stages of writing when you're trying to develop an idea and to work up evidence to support it. So you're giving readers what they need. They are trying to put what they're reading to personal use. And also, they're trying to resolve doubts or answer questions and overcome objections. So they're psychologically, when we're reading, this is how we operate. What good is this to me? Why would I want to continue reading? And you provide them with a means to do that, to find out how that can be helpful to them. So there's this delicate balance, or dance, if you will, between the writer and the reader. So we're giving readers what they need. And here are two really important areas when it comes to especially the personal narrative genre, your testimony. They're looking for touchstones, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. It's called crossing points, where they can find themselves in your writing. And secondly, they're learning to trust you. This is a big part of your responsibility as a writer. As a writer, you must establish trust between yourself and the reader. In personal narratives, perhaps more so than any other genre, readers assume that a real person is behind the story, a writer who speaks directly to them. So just as in a spoken conversation, it's a symbiotic relationship, if you will. And the reader completes this act of communication by paying attention to the writer's story, and the writer must establish right away a reason for the reader to be attentive. And for this to work, it's up to the writer to establish a certain level of trust. You as a writer become almost a truth-speaking guide, and you lead them to someplace worthwhile. So my question to you as writers is, what techniques do you think you can use in your personal narrative essay to establish the trust between you, the writer, and the reader? What techniques would you think need to be at play? Be authentic. And I want to go off on that, Gus. Be authentic is so good because when we reveal our own foibles, if you will, the reader can relax and they know they engage in a conversation with someone as human as they are. Did Jim Miller do that? He did, didn't he? He was honest with us as his audience. He told us there were some things along the way where I stumbled, and here they are. What's another way that we can develop trust between us as the writer and our audience? Yes, and I appreciate your saying that. Specific examples also work well. That's part of our vitalizing techniques. And also using our scriptures appropriately and being very clear in our presentation of the gospel. That's another way where we're learning to, they're learning to trust us as the writers. We have a big responsibility, don't we, as writers? But we realize it's a privilege. Now, there are two types of writers as I see them. I call the one category the novice, and I call the other category the veteran. And you can easily and quickly move from a novice to a veteran. And you might be the veteran already. But let me tell you the attributes of the novice writer and the attributes of the veteran writer. Most of the novice's difficulties start with a simple fact that the paper he or she is writing on is mute. And because it never talks back to him or her, and because he or she is concentrating so hard on generating ideas, that the tendency is to readily forget that another human being will eventually try to make sense of what you're writing. So the tendency as a novice writer is to think primarily of himself or herself. And here in a nutshell, if I might say that, is the ultimate reason for most bad writing. Because they're thinking of themselves, they're thinking of the vocabulary they are going to use or maybe try to impress the audience with, where let that go. Don't be egocentric in this, because it's important as a writer, just as it is in the Christian life, to be other-centered, other-focused. So the novice writer thinks primarily of himself or herself, thinks through an idea only until it is clear to the writer. I think I've got it. It's clear to me. I hope, and off it goes. I hope the audience gets it. And if they don't, shame on them. What's wrong with them anyway? Sometimes doesn't trouble to define terms, or doesn't vary the sentence structure, or paragraphs when the mood strikes. When you're writing, watch your paragraphs. There's some people who write in these whale-like paragraphs, and you read them, and by the time it's like, oh, you're so tired. And there's some who write in these very staccato-like paragraphs, and that tires you as well. So even when you're looking at your paragraphing, you're thinking in terms of the reader. You're thinking in terms of the audience. And there's some who end abruptly when the writer decides he or she's had enough. Okay, I guess that's done. I think we're over. And yet the reader feels unsatisfied. Like, yes, isn't there more? I don't feel that was a place to end. You left me hanging at the end of the article. Did you notice with Jim Miller's ending how he titled his essay Unknown Riches, and the last sentence of his essay read like this: It says, it is in Jesus Christ in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge, and my riches are truly found in him. He took us back to his title and brought it all together, so at the end, we as the reader thought, we were satisfied with it. And again, this is part of thinking of the other, thinking of the reader and not yourself as the writer. I call this unconscious writing. Unconscious writing is like this. It would be like if I'm up here speaking, but I'm turning my back to you and I'm talking to you about all the elements of good writing, and that good writing is aware of its audience. You must keep that in mind. Imagine if I spent my entire hour plus with my back to you. You would be offended. But too often when we read some work, it's that novice who is writing in that kind of perspective, of ignoring the audience completely. So the basic rules of writing is this: have good manners, as of any human relationship, and think of the audience. The veteran, on the other hand, does exactly that. He or she conceives the writing situation and realizes that all writing is communication, but most writing hopes to go further than that. And so to win writers, you have to have something that's worth their attention and their time, be sold on validity, and think always of the reader's convenience, not the writer's own. And realize that good writing is good manners, and that good manners has to do with the formatting, if you will, of your text. It has to do with, of course, your grammar and punctuation, but from beginning to end, you're thinking about serving your readers well, and you're anticipating the reader's responses as well. So courtesy is a big part of being a good writer. If I'm going too quickly, let me know and I'll slow down, see if some of you are taking notes from this. I can say this: clear prose is fatiguing. And I'm not going to fool you on this. To be a good writer is work. The easiest thing to do is to be, so to speak, the novice, and to write for yourself and think, I'm not going to consider the audience. The more difficult part is to sit down and you're thinking of your audience and how to serve them. And you're probably going to use muscles that you haven't used for a while. If you go water skiing and you haven't water skied for 5 years, you get back and you think, those muscles have been used, hard pressed. And the same is true in writing. If this is something that you haven't been working on for a while, those muscles now are going to start to be exercised. But I hope that you'll see that it strengthens your writing ability and strengthens the pieces that you're submitting for whatever situation it might be. Wait, I'm going to go back because I want to say something first. There's a paradox about writing. The worst way to communicate to the reader how you're feeling is to tell him or her. So here is another statement you're going to hear me repeat throughout the semester. Show, don't tell. And the way that you can do it, we have many different techniques to add vitality into our writing and get into the showing mode and not the telling mode. So my first recommendation to you as you're working on the personal narrative essay is add characters or people to your writing. People humanize your writing, and it gives the reader connections or those touchstones. And humanizing means populating your writing with signs of human life. And dehumanized writing talks about phenomena without any reference to human beings who experience them, as if the sight of them were merely in poor taste. People are what makes writing matter. And you can hardly have too many of them. You don't have to be writing about people to have lots of people in your writing. Any material, and get this now, any material, however impersonal and abstract, can be humanized. Now, the most obvious way is to mention people by name, and you want to make sure that you would have their permission to do that, or mention them by their first name. You can use quotes from real people or imagined quotes. But letting people talk is the audio portion of your writing. And so I'm going to encourage you to, especially in the personal narrative and also in the character sketch, use dialogue. Can we now go back and revisit the unknown riches? Tell me who the characters were in that essay. Who can you recall? Mom and Dad, him, and you chuckle at this, but the writer is a character in his own story, so that's absolutely true. What other characters did you find in the story? Think of his family. Who's in the family? The sisters. What kind of sisters were they? In fact, he referred to 3 mother-like sisters, remember? And he had an older brother. He also had some other names in there. His cousin, the 5-year-old cousin who got saved. He had mentioned Pastor Leonard Radke by name. He mentioned Pastor Dennis Roxer by name. But the person wasn't named, the girl wasn't named, but the person he had a relationship with for a short period of time. But ultimately, when you thought of the testimony, who rose to the top as the character in the story? Christ, Jesus Christ. And you saw that from beginning to end. And that's exactly what you want to also have come forth in your personal testimony. Please do not forget that. Do not forget your Savior, Jesus Christ, for he is an extremely important part of your testimony. So you think how you can weave that into your story without making it seem odd or just forced. That's what you don't want. You don't want it forced. You want it to become natural, and people can follow that with you. So characters humanize your writing. Another suggestion that I hope you take seriously when you're writing your narrative is the setting. And that has to do with the necessary background for understanding the action. It can be a physical setting, it can be a cultural setting, it can be a temporal setting, but it is really a necessary part, and it provides concrete vividness. And readers need that. They need to picture this in their minds as they're reading through it. So setting is also an important part of the identity of the character. Thinking of unknown riches. We go through several settings in this story. Can you name some of them for me? Where does the story begin? What is the setting? Do you remember? We're in high school, that's one of them, but where do we begin the story? Yep, but the setting. I'm talking about the place. Now, where did the story start to take place? He started with the opener, I walked the halls of my high school. Remember? That was his first paragraph. And then he transitions in the second paragraph, and he says, I was born in Duluth, Minnesota, the icebox of the United States, where it can get cold enough for spit to freeze before it hits the ground and people fish through the ice in the winter. He added that information because he thought my audience someday could be broader than Duluth, Minnesota. And indeed it was. He probably had people in Africa reading this testimony go, oh my, it gets cold enough for spit to freeze before it hits the ground and people fish through ice in the winter? Can you imagine that? That is a cold place. So again, that's part of the setting. He explains and describes it, and he thought of his readers as even outside of Duluth, Minnesota. He also had settings in the church and Sunday school, in the home. He also had it in the high school, the Bible study. Remember when he was in the high school and there was a Bible study? in the high school, and he didn't want anybody to know that he was going to the Bible study, so he put his Bible in his notebook so nobody would see it. But we were walking the halls. Remember, he walked the halls with the Bible hidden in the notebook. Also, he then brought us back again to his home. The plot. The plot has to do with stories that are always built around a plot conflict. It could be physical conflict, it could be a character conflict, it could be a spiritual conflict, but stories are always built around conflicts. And these conflicts build to some type of resolution, and when the resolution occurs, closure comes quickly. So you think of the story, and you have what's called the rising action, and then where was the climax, where some understanding hit him about his walk with the Lord? Where was that peak? Do you remember? He tried all the dead-end streets, and he realized they ended nowhere. They were nothing. And all of a sudden, he came to the conclusion, my riches are in Christ. And boom, down it fell. It's called the denouement, the falling action. Essay's over. And that's usually how it works in a very well-told story. Rising action rises. It comes to the conclusion where some revelation is discovered, so to speak, and then it falls, and the closure is just at the right place. All right, let's go back again to show, don't tell. And I put down, let the people talk, let the reader hear your people talking. Now, I understand memory is faulty. You want to be trying to go back and think about dialogue or conversations. And it's interesting with the unknown riches, there was no direct dialogue in this particular essay. It was indirect. So he didn't put quotation marks around it, but yet we could hear, so to speak, characters speaking. For instance, the mother. He says to her, nothing kept me out of that Sunday school chair. Not sickness, sporting events, a weary day of parenting, or even a Duluth blizzard. I mean nothing. Well, he didn't use her direct quotes. Well, we could hear Mama speaking in the background there, couldn't we? And that was working very effectively. But letting people talk is the audio portion of your program, so to speak, and dialogue matters. And it generally moves the action forward, and it captures the voice of the speaker to whom you are referring. But be aware of elaborate taglines. Don't overdo, he said, she said angrily. By the way you write, we can tell that. So don't belabor the point. And as you're changing dialogue with each person, you change paragraph, and that's how the reader can follow it, and they don't need the he said, she said. So that works probably the most effectively when we're doing dialogue. All of this will be learned along the way as you're writing, but I'm giving you these helpful hints before you start your writing. Consider your intended effect, the tone or the voice, and when I talk about tone, it's the emotional mood of your piece. Emotional mood of your piece. So unknown riches. What tone is coming from this? What kind of voice do I hear from the writer? Is it formal? No, not formal. It's more what? Say it, yes, please. Casual. Yes, it's more conversational, isn't it? It's more like friend to friend. And that's what we like about the personal narrative testimony. Our tone and our voice change, sometimes based upon our genre, but I can tell you this, writers, there will come a time, and it probably will be in April, where I don't even need to see the name on the essay or the paper. I can tell who wrote it, because each writer has his or her own unique voice. And that's a good thing. That's a very good thing. But we want to make sure that our voice or tone is appropriate to the genre occasion. We also, as Christian writers, think about the takeaway. This is so important because we're not just writing for ourselves. We're writing about what are they going to take away from this? What are they going to see that's going to be spiritually encouraging and helpful to them? And so as you're writing, you're thinking about that. And you're also thinking about the crossing points. That's where your readers see themselves in what you write. Oh, I see that. I understand. I've experienced that. And there are many crossing points where they meet themselves in your article. Now you think about the audience for Unknown Riches, and we established that at the beginning of the session. And we said the audience was probably people who had been saved at a younger age and grew up in a Christian home. So these are the people that are thinking about what is the takeaway for me and what are the crossing points. And when we're writing, we're always thinking of what's the point of view? What's the point of view? What point of view am I going to write this in? This gets back to our grammar lessons now on pronouns. We know that pronouns have point of view, don't they? They have first person point of view, they have second person point of view, and they have third person point of view. So when I'm writing something, I'm saying, okay, what's my point of view? And I have to stay there for the most part. I better stay in my point of view. And every story is told by a storyteller. A testimony is typically in the first person point of view. So let me talk for a moment about this, because this is very important. Novice writers shift points of view throughout their essays or their writings, and then you get lost as the reader. These shift between first person and second person or third person, and you have to consider what person am I going to stay in. Typically, the narrative essay is written from a first person point of view using the pronouns I, me, we, us. And as we just mentioned in the personal narrative, it is the I who exists as a character in your own narrative. So at first blush, it seems like all personal narratives must use the first person. However, skillful writers, some skillful writers I have seen, do use second and third person to a wonderful effect. However, let me caution you. Second person, you, is rare in personal narratives because it tends to invite reader resistance, and when you're using second person, you, it's like you're pointing the finger at them and they're becoming quite uncomfortable with that. Now, we use second person to a great advantage when we're teaching a process, but it doesn't feel right in the personal narrative. So keep this in mind as you're writing and making those writers' decisions. Who comes to mind, though, who used a different point of view in the personal narrative? And I asked you to read that for this evening. Do you remember who that was? Yeah. Paul, yes. Paul, when he was writing about his experience into the third heaven. We'll talk about that later. All right, back to show, don't tell. Well, here's what I call generalized abstractions. These are the telling modes. He was really tormented. It was the most exciting journey of my life. She was so scared. Here's some more generalizations. He was a great soul winner. It was the most engaging class in college. He was a dynamic preacher. And I put down replace generalizations with concretions. My question to you is, what type of verbs are being used in these sentences? Linking. And then we tend then to go into the passive voice, and then we hide behind it. Instead of showing the audience how he was a great soul winner, how it was the most engaging class. So I, as the reader, will come to that conclusion. Don't tell me. Show me. Imagine this. Picture a young George Washington with a hatchet hidden behind his back, and he says to his father, I cannot tell a lie. The cherry tree was chopped down. But we know he didn't say that. The hatchet was very visible, and what did he say to his father? I chopped down the cherry tree. When you get into that passive telling mode, you lose the characters, you lose the main idea, and you wear down your reader. So here's some suggestions I'm going to give you to add concretions or vitalizing techniques to your writing. Build your essay up with concretions. Those are the things that you can perceive with your five senses: tastes, smells, sights, sounds, touches. And the opposite of concretions are abstractions, which are thoughts, opinions, feelings, ideas, and concepts. Let the reader feel what you're feeling, smell what you're smelling, see what you're seeing, and evoke that sensation. And you can do that with concretion ideas that I'm going to share with you. So understand the effects of your choices. Concrete language, because it involves the senses, is emotionally intense and it makes us feel. It's easier to understand. So the key is to find concrete ways of talking about abstractions. I'm going to say that again. The key is finding concrete ways to talk about abstractions, and the Bible is so good with this. In fact, I want you to think about that. Were you in John 15? Have you been in John 15? All right. What concrete images does the Lord Jesus use to bring out the concept of abiding in him? What does he use? Yeah, think of John 15. The vine and the branches. Because abiding in him could be a difficult thing to get a hold of with our senses, because it's abstract, if you will. But the vine and the branch metaphor, analogy, can't you just picture that? As you're abiding in Christ, he is the vine, we are the branches, and the Father is the vine dresser, the husband. And all of that abstract idea comes to play, and we understand it clearly. So I'm so thankful for how the Bible uses that for us. We think about other scriptural examples of metaphors. A virtuous woman is what? A crown to her husband. Wow. That portrays a very nice picture, doesn't it? The name of the Lord is a strong tower. That, again, adds concretion to that thought from Proverbs 18:10. My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle. Those are all, again, metaphors that allow us to concretize and picture those. So those are metaphors and similes, and we're going to work more with that as we go on. Another way that you can add concretions, like I mentioned, is tell stories within a larger story. So within the unknown riches, yes, this is a story, but there were small stories, small anecdotes within the larger story. So that worked out really well for Jem. Using the active voice. Just as you heard me say in grammar, what is the most important word in the sentence? You know it. It's the verb. And in your writing, the same is true. Verbs are the most important words in your sentences and the part of speech most likely to go abstract. Because our tendency is to go to that passive voice, the is, are, was, were, be, being, been, am. And yes, sometimes that has to be in there, of course. But for it to dominate our writing, the passive construction makes people disappear. That's exactly what's going to happen to your writing, and we don't want that, because then also we become very wordy. Examples are another great way to add concretions to our writing. What's my evidence? How do I know? What examples can I give? So the showing mode, remind yourself that when you turn to the generalization, that's a good place for people to hide, and we don't want to do that as writers. And now that you know that your audience is larger than the instructor, you don't want to generalize. You want that audience to really get engaged in what you have to share. So you allow concrete facts to emerge from behind cliches. You want to know what cliches are, your writers? Cliches are those worn out, tired expressions. When it was first used that this man, who is 50 years old, is over the hill, the first time somebody wrote that, I thought, wow, that is really clever. That's great. That's a descriptive term. And then another person used it, another person used it, hundreds use it, thousands use it. And now when you find it in writing, you go like, heard that 100 times before. So we want to try to avoid cliches in our writing. And we can even find cliches that we use in our Christian writing. We don't want to do that. We don't want to have expressions that people have heard many times before, and they tend to tune out. So replace generalizations with smells, sounds, specific gestures, objects, physical features, and to illustrate by examples. So now that I have the foundation laid for the personal narrative, let's talk about the personal narrative and your writing of that, which will be your first major paper assignment. The narrative essay in this course is going to take two different forms, so you'll be writing two narratives. The first one will be your personal testimony, and the second one will be a character sketch or portrait of a Bible character or victorious Christian that you know that you want to write about. But it's interesting with narrative writing, it has little visible signs of structure or thesis. And when we get to the more formal argumentative writing, we will become more formal and our style will change. But in this one, because it's more conversational in tone, it's more loose, though we realize that it still has structure to it. So we have an opener, and we have a ending, and we have a space to be filled in between. But there will be no template that I'm going to give you for this essay. Because what I recommend that you do is you sit down with the door closed, if you can find some quiet time to do that, and then you write, and you write, and it could be messy, it could be chaotic, but you're just writing about your story, and it's taking form. You have probably a paragraph, you're doing what's called free writing. Take a step away from it for an hour or two, or maybe you want to come back the next day, and you get in and you look at what you've written, you say, okay, I like this, maybe I want this to be my opener, this could be the text in between, maybe this is how I want to close, and you go back and rewrite. But you're thinking then, as you're going along with the drafts, okay, how do I want to open, and how do I want to close, and becoming with the structure. But it's not as structural as other genres that we're going to be writing in this class. But your theme is, I want to bring the readers into this world, into my testimony. It's up to you, though, to decide upon the design of your essay. The essay as a story, which is what this is rooted in experience, and you probably noticed that in Jim Miller's. It was his experience as a young man growing up in a Christian home. That was his theme. I could not find a thesis statement in there, nor did I need to. And it had a beginning, middle, and ending. But from its very opener, the tone and subject were very clear. The reader doesn't give you much time, whether or not he or she's going to buy into what you have to say. We learned that as readers ourselves. I grew up what was known as a wealthy side of town. Okay. We were known as cake eaters, and to many of my classmates, the title was very fitting. See how he captured me right from the beginning? So the tone of the essay was there right from the opening statements. And yet it was specific in detail. There were descriptions of people and places, so it kept my interest. I've noticed that the personal essay is the most publishable of all genres of nonfiction writing. And maybe even more important than being published is the deep pleasure and satisfaction you will have of sharing your testimony with others, sharing the grace of God with others and how the Lord has worked in your life, not only for salvation, but from all points forward. And other people have the privilege of reading that and are encouraged by that. So that gives glory to the Lord, and that's what we want to do. We don't want it to be all about us. We want it to be all about Him and our blessed Savior, Jesus Christ, and sharing that story of our salvation in Him. Narrative writing is an art and it's a craft. And there are two elements that we see in narrative writing, and one is dramatic intensity, where the reader feels he or she is in the scene, living it along with the writer. When I read Unknown Riches by Jim Miller, I felt I was there. And I was there with every phase of his story, and I was looking forward to what's going to happen next as I'm turning the page, and how will this end? That's what dramatic intensity is in good narrative writing. And the intended effect is the reader senses everything leads to one strong effect. It takes to some emotional endpoint. Now, another suggestion that I have for you writers. This is how his last sentence ended. Excuse me, I'm going to go a couple sentences before that. My Savior, my story is really the story of my Savior dying for me and now working in and through me. He is all that I need. It is Jesus Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge, and my riches are truly found in him. My suggestion for you as writers writing the personal narrative is not to have the very last statement you made, the verse. He had the verse in the last sentence, but then he concluded it on the end and said, and my riches are truly found in him. That is effective writing in the narrative for the personal testimony. And that was the intended effect. And he again took that and he brought it back, and he found his title in his close. I will be talking about titling in the future, but let me give you this helpful hint because you will be thinking about the title for your personal narrative. You'll find it somewhere along the way. Some writers know their title right away, and that's happened to me, where I have the title before I even have written anything. And sometimes I don't have the title until the end, until I've written my way through it and I see something, or the way I close it, there it is. That's the title, and you'll find it there. But it's important that you title your work. And Jim chose to bring his title as his very closing line in his essay. I would be remiss as your Gibbs composition teacher not to take you in and study the stories of the Bible, the most beautiful stories that have ever been written, because the style of the Bible is uniquely powerful and beautiful. And it can be parodied but never duplicated. And we know that narrative is a dominant form in the scripture. The stories vary widely in regard to its fullness. We have historical chronicles using documentary impulse to tell what happened. But we also know that the stories are also in historical chronicles, and we have studied those as a larger stories and smaller stories within the larger. So we have full-fledged stories that present an event rather than simply tell it, and they use all the modes of good, effective story writing techniques. Some are full, some are circumstantial, and they are embellished with detail, whether they're the long historical narratives or they're the shorter ones that we studied in the birthright, story of the birthright. So here's what we see in the stories of the Bible, and I bring this to you because you as Gibbs students will be telling stories if you're not doing that already. You're telling stories in your Sunday school classes, you're telling stories at camps, you're telling stories at retreats, maybe some other kind of venue. But it's important to see the elements of good story writing, and it'll make you a better storyteller. So here is what we see in the stories of the Bible, the style of the Bible, for which we're so fortunate to read. And it has concreteness all throughout it. It takes abstractions and it makes it concrete for us to be able to understand. We also see that it's realism. It's true stories that happen that we can identify with. And yet they're very simple. That's the beauty of these stories. They're so simple that even a child can understand. And don't the children love the stories of the Bible? Indeed they do. And yet there's meaning for them, behind them, that we can teach. They have settings to them. Many of the stories are very brief. Think about the story of the birthright. How many verses was that story? 8. There are similes and metaphors within these stories. They have effective power, certainly because they were written by the Holy Spirit, inspired the writers. There's a prevalence of dialogue in the narratives. There's repetition quite often. And there's plot motifs, and there are character types within the stories. So all of these affect the style of the Bible regarding the stories. And I ask you to read one for tonight. So if you don't mind, take out your Bibles and turn to Genesis 25, 27 through 34. And I'm going to ask you a few questions about the story of the birthright. So looking at verse 27, the first sentence reads like this: so the boys grew. That followed the 3 verses of the birth of Esau and Jacob. That moved rather quickly, didn't it, in that story? So the boys grew. And Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a mild man dwelling in tents. And Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Now Jacob cooked a stew, and Esau came in from the field, and he was weary. And Esau said to Jacob, "Please feed me with that same red stew, for I am weary." Therefore his name was called Edom. But Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright as of this day." And Esau said, "Look, I'm about to die. So what is this birthright to me?" Then Jacob said, "Swear to me as of this day." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. And Jacob gave Esau bread and a stew of lentils. Then he ate and drank, arose, and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. How is this story rooted in the familiar? Thinking about the setting and what the story revolves around. What is the familiar that we can identify with here? Hunger, and also jealousy, sibling rivalry, if you will. It's a type of story that's thoroughly rooted in familiar events of everyday reality. Where is the background information provided for the story? What's the setup? Yes, verse 28 is what Gus just said. Yes. Yes. So verses are actually 1 and 2 actually give us the background information. And what opening contrast is presented? I hope that you as writers, but also as grammarians, pick this up. What type of sentence structure did you find in the first 2 verses, 27 and 28? Comparison, contrast. So you saw Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was. The second one, Isaac loved Esau because he ate of the game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. What is the setting for this story? Where does it take place? Tent. There we go. Tent, and right away I know, oh my, Jacob has the advantage here because Esau's out of his element. He was not a man who stayed at home. He didn't feel familiar in the tent. He was one who liked to be out in the field hunting game. So right away, Jacob set an advantage. What is the conflict? One has something the other wants. The conflict is the struggle to secure the benefits represented by the birthright, correct? And Jacob's chief strategy for getting the upper hand is a struggle to put Esau in a position that tests him. And with the smell of pottage in his nostrils, Esau is an easy game. And Jacob knew that. So there is the plot conflict as we watch the birthright change ownership and the brothers' respective fortunes reversed in that very exchange. How does detail contribute to the action of the exchanged birthright? What detail do you see here? There's a lot of detail in here. Shows the different boys' priorities. What descriptions do we see in here? What color is the stew? Red. What does Edom mean? Red. Isn't that interesting? What other details do we see? We see that, oh, go ahead, yes, please. I'm going to die, yes. And you can hear his dialogue, and it's almost guttural in sense, isn't it? And then Jacob's dialogue is very poised and so-called in control. And Jacob gave Esau, here's more details, bread, stew of lentils, and here are the action verbs. He ate, he drank, he arose, he went. And that very last sentence is the storyteller's interpretive comment Give it to me, please. Thus Esau despised his birthright. And we know that to be true because we've read that in Hebrews. Is it Hebrews 12:14? 12:16, where it says, Esau was a profane person who for one morsel of food sold his birthright. So what is the cause-effect sequence with beginning, middle, and end? 8 verses. Did it start where we knew the characters right away from the beginning? What was Esau? Skillful hunter, man of the field. Contrast, Jacob was a mild man, dwelling in tents. And here we see where the sibling rivalry came in. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of the game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So do we know the characters through their words and actions? Indeed. And then what is the point of view of the story? Is it first person, second person, third person? Is the narrator telling the story? Of course we know. Third person point of view. Yes. I asked you to read Paul's personal narrative in 2 Corinthians. Particularly, I asked you to read verses 1 through 4, but you could have read the entire portion. Please turn to that now. 2 Corinthians. And I'm looking for your observations in this. 2 Corinthians 12, 1 through 4, Paul is telling of the glorious visions that illumined his arduous way. He dates this to about 40 AD, when he was in the midst of his work in Syria and Cilicia. He declares that he was caught up into the third heaven, which is the abode of God. And he says this, I know a man in Christ, who 14 years ago, whether in the body I do not know, or whether out of the body I do not know, God knows. Such a one was caught up to the third heaven, and I know such a man. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know, God knows. How he was caught up into paradise and heard inexpressible words, which is not lawful for a man to utter. He switches the point of view. What point of view is he in verses 1 or 2 through 4? He's in third person point of view. So my question is, what reason do you think that he wrote that particular portion in the third person point of view? That's right, that's what I think. He doesn't want to make it about himself. And he refers to it from that point of view and that perspective. We've done quite a bit already with studying for the craft, the unknown riches with Jim Miller, so we're going to skip over this because of time. But I do want to talk about a couple other narratives that I want to bring to your attention. And remember how I said that the writers determine how they're going to title a piece? I had a writer, Katie Morrison, in my last Gibbs composition class, and she had her personal narrative titled The Weight of a Feather. And she didn't come to this title until she looked at the C.H. Mackintosh quote, nothing must ever be added, not the weight of a feather, to that precious blood which has perfectly satisfied God as a judge, and which perfectly shelters every soul that has fled for safety behind it. And when she read that piece by C.H. Mackintosh, she said, there it is. That's a title for my personal narrative, that nothing can be added at all to the salvation. It's not by works. And so she came up with the title of her essay. So you'll find your titles in unique places, and it might be where you're looking and reading something else, and you think that's a title I want to add to my narrative. I want to bring your attention to some other work as well. These will be part of your assignments. Jolene Miller, in fall 2009, she was in my Gibbs composition class, wrote Peace for the Fearful Skeptic, and I want you to read this as part of your assignment. But I want you to listen to her opener. And it begins like this. We know this is true because it's in the Bible. I heard my second grade Sunday school teacher say in an irritating sing-song voice while she held a Noah's Ark illustration. 4 eventful years passed before I believed her words. There was her opener. She's going to take us through, so to speak, those 4 years, and she's going to come at the end of her essay to the conclusion of what happened in those 4 years. But she caught us right away by her opener, and she used dialogue in her very first line. Her next paragraph reads, during my early childhood, our family spent Sundays boating in the summer and snowmobiling in the winter. We never attended church. My stoic grandmother gave me an illustrated children's Bible for Christmas during my kindergarten year. Occasionally, my mom read stories from it at my bedtime. The dull pictures and bizarre stories bored me. I preferred to read Mickey Mouse, Cinderella, or Three Billy Goats Gruff. Anything but the Bible. So there's her opener, 2 paragraphs, and she caught our attention, and she makes us want to read on. That's one of your assignments, is to read that from the Grace Family Journal. Another assignment that you're going to have is to listen on Unshackled to Bernie Bischoff's personal narrative testimony. I noticed Pastor Roxer sent out this afternoon the Grace for the Race, and he has a link in there where you can listen to it. Now, you might say, I've already listened to it, Carol. Well, that's great. I'm glad that you have, but I want you to go back and listen to it again. And this time, I want you to listen to it as a writer and listen to the various techniques that he used to tell that story. But, as I mentioned, good writing reads out loud well. And here was his opener. Drinking was a big part of growing up on Minnesota's Iron Range. Summer vacations included many fishing trips to Leech Lake with my father and his brothers. Along with fond memories of the fishing were other memories of coolers of beer and my dad staying up so late at night that he was unable to go fishing in the morning. My father's brother, Herman, would drive from Milwaukee each summer for a few weeks of vacation. Herman's car was always full of empty beer cans and old cigarette packs. He would pull into the driveway at sunrise, beer in hand, ready to go fishing. My job was to bait Herman's hook, untangle his fishing lines, and get him beers out of the cooler. There was his opener. Did you notice the details? You see he named people. He had the particulars. He had the setting all the way from the beginning. But again, let me emphasize that as you're writing your personal testimony, it's not all about you. It's not even about the characters within your essay. It's all about Jesus Christ and giving him the glory through the testimony that you write. So there's another part of your assignment. I also want you to be prepared to discuss both narratives, and then on March 26th, your personal narrative essay will be due to me. This will not be your final version. It'll go through several iterations, but it comes to me, and I will give you feedback, and it usually takes me a couple weeks, and then I'll give it back to you. I will not be here in 2 weeks, which I think is March 12th, because it's the week of the ladies' retreat, so I'll be busy getting prepared for that. So this essay will be due. I'm going to ask of you that you have a title page with it, where you have the title of your essay, and then you have, of course, your name, and then my name submitted to, and then the date of submission, and I can send this to you as an attachment in an email so you know how to format that. I get the question, Carol, how long should these narrative essays be? And I went through some that students had submitted in the past, and typically they were running anywhere from 5 to 7 pages in length. Jolene's essay was 6 pages long, The Weight of a Feather, 5 pages. Bernie's essay was 7 pages in length. These are double spaced, and so I'm not hard and fast on this, but you don't want to be too long either. So keep that in mind as you're writing it. That's your assignments for the upcoming few weeks. Do you have any questions of me? And I'll be asking for your first writing piece in just a few moments. Well, thank you. Time went by very quickly, so I appreciate the opportunity to teach you how to write well. So now you can take a 15-minute break, Tester?
Yeah, 15.
10:15.